that's urgently important in our society today. Thank you. Thomas Lombardo, PhD, is a director of the Center of Future Consciousness and the Wisdom Page and Professor Emeritus of Psychology, Philosophy, and the Future at Rio Salado College. He is a fellow and executive board member of the World Future Studies Federation and member of numerous other futurist organizations. He has published 8 books and over 50 articles and given an equal number of national and international professional presentations. His newest book, Future Consciousness, is the winner of the Scientific and Medical Network Book Award of 2017. Please give a big HSGP welcome to Thomas Lombardo, PhD. Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Good, okay. And the screen is pretty clear. Oops, I'm going to trip on all these wires. Okay, so hello. Some of you may have seen me here. I was here about a year ago, and I talked about my book, Future Consciousness, and I've come back to visit again. And thank you, Ron, and thank you, Richard. Oh, there you are over there. Today I'm going to be talking about something different, although connected with future consciousness. Let me just tell you a little bit more about myself. Ron already mentioned that I'm the director of the Center for Future Consciousness and the Wisdom Page, and also I have an online journal called Wisdom in the Future, which you can subscribe to by going to either of those 2 websites. And over the years, I've been interested in psychology, philosophy, evolution, the future over the last 15, 20 years. And here's a number of my books that I have published over, 20, 25 years now on various aspects of the human mind and consciousness and the future of science and technology. Jeannie and I, in fact, did one book together, my dear wife, Mind Flight, which is up there too, and all of these books are available on Amazon. More recently, last year I talked on my book, Future Consciousness, which came out in 2017, and this tiny little paperback or pocketbook I did that just came out this year called The Pursuit of Virtue. And both of those books are up here for sale. In fact, today I was going to be talking on my book on science fiction. And the science fiction book is up here as well. The science fiction book is a big project for me. It's something to do during my presumed years of retirement, so I don't retire and drop dead from it, because I think retiring is dropping dead. So I took it upon myself a few years back to conceptualize, after I've been teaching courses in science fiction, that I was going to write a history of science fiction and talk to my publisher about it. My publisher enjoyed the idea too, and it turned out that once I had mapped the whole thing out, it was a 4-volume project. So I'm just going to introduce this to you today. The cover you see up there is for Volume 1, which has come out now. In fact, it came out in December of 2018. That's Science Fiction, the Evolutionary Mythology of the Future. Volume 1, Prometheus to the Martians. Volume 2 is almost finished. I'm working on it right now. The Time Machine to Star Maker. And then Volume 3 will be The Golden Age to the New Wave. And then Volume 4 will be Star Wars to the Singularity and Beyond. And I will introduce you today to these volumes, focusing mostly on Volume 1. And the 4 volumes basically are a study of science fiction, its history, its nature, and its value. And I have a bunch of ideas about what I think science fiction is and what its value is and how significant it is. And in these 4 volumes, I trace out its history, going all the way back to Greek myths, because science fiction actually evolved out of ancient mythology. So today, my introduction is going to be focused primarily on Volume 1, and actually primarily only on the first 2 chapters of Volume 1, because that's plenty for an hour. Famous opening words. Yet across the gulf of space, minds that are to our minds, as ours are to those beasts that perish, intellects vast and cool and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes, and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. And those are the opening lines of a very famous novel written in 1890, published in 1898. Yeah, 1898. And what I'm going to do to add 5 minutes to my presentation is I'm going to give you a 5-minute video of a movie, one of a couple, that was inspired by this novel. And this movie I went to see in 1953 when I was 6 years old. And it had a great impact on my mind at that time, which I will explain. But first, I'd like you to immerse yourself in the following 5 minutes of this mesmerizing and deeply philosophical excerpt from George Pal's The War of the Worlds.
Target as indicated. Repeat, target as indicated. The 75s report they've got them under local sight, sir.
I think we should try to make them understand we mean them no harm.
There's another machine coming out.
They are living creatures out there.
They're not human. Dr. Forrester says they're some kind of advanced civilization.
If they're more advanced than us, they should be nearer the Creator for that reason.
A key line, think about
Moving
that.
target. Prepare to follow up.
No real attempt has been made to communicate with them, you know.
Let's go back inside, Uncle Matthew.
I've done all I can in there. You go back. Sylvia. I like that Dr. Forrester. He's a good man.
Attention all batteries. Prepare for volley fire. Repeat. Prepare for volley fire.
Who's that? What's he think he's doing? Too late now. He's too far away.
Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil.
It's seen him.
Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord
Can't get through to them. They put out some sort of electromagnetic covering, a protective blister. be what they used to wipe out the French city. It neutralizes mesons somehow. They're the atomic glue holding matter together. Cut across their lines of magnetic force and any object will simply cease to exist. Take my word for it, General. This type of defense is useless against that kind of power. You'd better let Washington know. Fast! Hold him as long as you can. Right there.
Everything pulled back north of Highway 60 Tunnel Runner. Right! Everybody out! The Air Force will take care of these babies now. Dr. Forrester, get out of here! Everybody out of here! Everybody out!
Boom. Now imagine you're 6 years old and you're watching that. Yes. And as I mentioned, that was George Pal's 1953 version of The War of the Worlds, based on H.G. Wells' novel that was actually published back in 1898. And I went to see that movie at the time with my parents in the Alhambra Theater in Waterbury, Connecticut. And boy, did that movie really energize my adrenaline and energize my consciousness and mind. And I left there thinking that, you know, I'm going to write a story about aliens invading the Earth. It inspired me. In fact, that childhood experience of watching War of the Worlds was only one of many experiences I had, primarily with science fiction movies back in the 1950s. Besides War of the Worlds, I saw Invaders from Mars, which was very spooky and scary, and When Worlds Collide. Some of these you may remember. The Time Machine, also by Wells, Continent Them, about the giant ants. The Thing, which starred James Arness of Gunsmoke fame, playing The Thing, which was based on John Campbell's Who Goes There, a very famous science fiction story. And the best of the 1950s, the most imaginative and intelligent science fiction movie of that era, Forbidden Planet, starring Walter Pidgeon and Leslie Nielsen before Leslie Nielsen became a comedian. Yes, and in some of these, of course, you may remember, some of these you've seen. But I was very immersed in science fiction, and as I mentioned with seeing War of the Worlds, I thought I should write a story about science fiction. I actually wrote a story, I still have it, 65 years later, about aliens invading the Earth, and I got the kids in the neighborhood to agree to put on a play. We were going to stage this story. So between watching the movie and getting them involved in it and actually trying to create a play, I was personally immersed in the experience of science fiction and War of the Worlds and other ones. In fact, it impacted my emotions, my motivation. It generated all these incredible sights and sounds. It got me thinking. It spurred on my imagination and creativity. It expanded my consciousness and introduced me to the mystery and wonder of the universe. And it actually got me involved in social collaboration. Indeed, science fiction produces total person immersion. All of the aspects of the human mind, the human psyche, are stimulated and engaged through science fiction, whether it be cinema or whether it be the literature. Indeed, as some of you will be familiar, we have these famous characters on TV now, the Big Bang characters, who science fiction indeed is a way of life for them. And here they are, Sheldon and Rashish and Leonard, and who's the fourth one I'm forgetting there? Howard. Yes, I always forget Howard. Dressed up in Star Trek outfits on the way to a Star Trek convention, of which they avidly participate in, and they have just recently been robbed, and they're out there wandering around in the middle of the desert. But for the characters in Big Bang, science fiction is a way of life. They're immersed in it. They're immersed in the movies, the video games, the costumes, the gadgetry, the comic books. All different aspects of their life are reflective of the influence of science fiction. In fact, science fiction for lots of people, including these characters, provides a paradigm in the sense of Thomas Kuhn's paradigm for living and understanding reality. And to show you what I mean, here's some illustrations of people who are immersed in science fiction. In the center there is a very famous and noteworthy sculpture by Clee Richardson, who created this 8-foot-tall metal hideous being, the Shrike, which sits in the entranceway of the driveway of Dan Simmons' house in the mountains of Colorado, because Dan Simmons is the creator, mental creator, of the Shrike, which is one of the most famous alien, if it is alien, it's not even quite sure if it's alien, beings in contemporary science fiction. People dress up in science fiction. People think science fiction. People live, eat, and breathe it. And not just simply the characters on the Big Bang. And the greatest example of this is the Trekkies. The Trekkies are an extremely avid fandom community who have conventions every year, who go to the conventions and have all the different actors and actresses from different Star Trek series come, and the Star Trek characters have achieved fame and notoriety, from Captain Kirk and Mr. Spock to the Ferengi and the Star Trek Enterprise, and who else is up there? The Andorians and young Spock and the various other characters from other series. In fact, they did a movie a number of years ago called Trekkies, in which they have on the poster here an infant dressed up in a Star Trek costume. That is, you learn this very early in life to be part of the Star Trek and science fiction fandom community. Science fiction, indeed, is the most visible, influential, and popular contemporary form of futurist thinking and imagination in the modern world. It impacts more people more deeply than any other mode of future consciousness. And that's because it engages your intellect, your imagination, your emotions, your behavior, your senses, your values. It takes you to a cosmic level, all pertaining to the future. It speaks to the whole person, stimulating and enhancing all the dimensions of human consciousness of the future. And the expression I would use there for that is it stimulates, engages holistic future consciousness. Now, since I introduced that long-winded expression, let me just give you a little bit deeper or more detailed understanding of that. Holistic future consciousness means all of those psychological processes which all of us have, including our desires, emotions, images, feelings about the future, our consciousness of the future, and our consciousness in the future, not in the sense of being able to foresee it, but to imagine it, to think about it, to have desires and goals with respect to it. That is, all the ways in which our mind engages the future. And it does so emotionally, it does so intellectually, it does so imaginatively, and that's out of my book, Future Consciousness. And in fact, I would suggest, but this is another whole presentation, that is our capacity for imagining, thinking about, making plans about, having goals and feelings about the future that has been the most distinctive, empowering ability that the human mind possesses, and it's what is responsible for the evolution of human civilization. This is our power, our strength, that we can think and imagine out ahead. And if you think about human society and human civilization, everything in it is a product of our capacity to think, imagine, and have goals about the future. And science fiction has a unique and increasingly powerful role in the ongoing purposeful evolution of our future consciousness. And what that simply means is that science fiction stimulates our future consciousness and it actually contributes to its further evolution. And it does so now more powerfully than any other mode of consciousness or thinking about the future. And in part it does so because science fiction is stories. And the human mind resonates to the narrative, to the story. Telling people stories is psychologically the most impactful way of having an influence on them. When you give them a theory, when you give them abstractions, when you give them mathematics, when you give them numbers, people's eyes glaze over. When you give them an engaging story that grabs their attention. So science fiction grabs the attention of the human mind because science fiction is in the form of stories. And that's what the human mind in particular resonates to. Tell me stories about the future. Tell me stories about the past. And so throughout history, narratives have provided identity, meaning, value, purpose, and engaging experiences. So when we get into science fiction, we don't just simply understand it through science fiction, we live and we feel it through the narratives, whether they're written or whether they're multimedia in the cinema. So as an opening definition of science fiction, I could say that it's a narrative approach to the future involving plots and action sequences, settings and drama, of course, sometimes even comedy, and varied and unique characters, which it does very well, human and otherwise. It's to a significant degree informed and inspired by modern science and contemporary thought, and it can be thought of as highly detailed scenario building and thought experiments about the future set in the form of stories, and more. And I'll come to the more later on because it's more than just simply about the future, but it's at least that much, and that's been its focus. So putting all that together, science fiction stimulates, excites, arouses, and evolves our holistic future consciousness. It creates a total way of life for lots of people and a paradigm for the future and how to approach the future through creation of stories which engage people psychologically, emotionally, and socially. Now, there's a lot of different dimensions to this holistic future consciousness in science fiction. Of course, there's the literature. As a recommendation, in case you've never got into reading science fiction and would like to, the Science Fiction Hall of Fame is a 3-volume set of stories voted on by the members of the Science Fiction Writers Association as the best stories ever written in science fiction up through the 1970s. That's a very good collection, an introductory collection to familiarize yourself with the literature. But besides the literature, there's science fiction cinema. And whether you've ever noticed this or not, for the last 40 years, almost all of the biggest money-making movies in the world have been science fiction. Only a few non-science fiction movies have broken into the top 10, Titanic being one of them. But science fiction has come to dominate the cinema. And science fiction cinema is a way in which lots of people have their most powerful and frequent experiences of science fiction in the cinema. And it's holistic because it's not just simply dialogue, not just simply narrative, it's visualization, it's sounds, it's action, it's all of the perceptual senses engaged. Not smell, of course. Now, there's all of the communities and fandom of clubs of science fiction. And the communities and fandom and clubs of science fiction go back 100 years. There's the modern stuff, but there's been clubs around for a very, very long time. So people get into the social dimension of science fiction. There's the art and music of science fiction. I don't know whether you're familiar with it or not, but science fiction has stimulated an immense number of incredibly imaginative and creative contemporary artists. Up here are just some of the artwork of famous science fiction artists, and there's also science fiction music too. And I don't even have anything up on that. But science fiction has a whole heritage of art that goes back well over 100 years and has a lot of very significant contemporary artists. Then there's the comics and the graphic novels, and this starts up back in the 1920s and 30s with Buck Rogers and Flash Gordon and Superman, and the comics is another significant dimension of science fiction and holistic future consciousness through science fiction. This is some of the earlier stuff back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. And then we have Stan Lee come along with Marvel Comics and create a whole new plethora of comic book characters. And if you think about these characters, if you haven't done this before, all of these superheroes are science fiction characters. They have various technologically augmented or genetically produced superpowers, almost like the gods of ancient times, and they engage in all kinds of techno-razzle-dazzle conflict and maneuvers, etc. This is all science fiction. And the superheroes have dominated, excuse me, the cinema the last 10, 15 years. There's been a lot of it. You may not know, but Watchmen, which was a graphic novel written back in the late 1980s, is listed by Time magazine as one of the greatest novels of the English language of the last 100 years. It's a comic book. It was made into a movie. If you haven't seen the movie, I would recommend watching it. Huh? Pardon me? It's better as a comic. You are right, but if you're going to have one or the other, thank you. So he's seen them both, or he's read them both. Okay. Yes, and I have two. Okay, I have the book, and I also have the movie. You could read the comic, or else you can go see the movie. But this is a indication of the intellectual, imaginative heights that the comics and graphic novels have come to, and have spilled over and now into the movies too. There's all the conventions and awards in science fiction. And science fiction has been on TV and the radio, and as a great example back on the radio is Orson Welles' dramatization of the War of the Worlds that he did back in 1938, where a lot of people actually thought that the Martians were invading New Jersey. But science fiction has permeated into TV back, excuse me, can I get a cough drop, sweetie? Where did I put them? Yeah, someplace. They're in my, yes, I have a tickle in my throat. Thank you. What did I put? No, excuse me a second. Yes, we're being very discreet. What did I do with my bag? No, it was the, I'll carry on. Oh, here it is, Back. Pardon me a second. For some reason I have a...
You know what, we didn't hand out this.
Oh, yes.
Where are they?
They're right here. No, they're...
Yeah, I've got one.
Here they are.
I've got a cough drop.
Good. Okay, my wife just reminded me I never handed out the handouts. Be that as it may, she's going to get me a cough drop. Science fiction came in the 1950s in TV up through the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And of course, in more contemporary times, like up to today, we have The Man in the High Castle, The Handmaid's Tale, Black Mirror, and American Gods as some recent examples of science fiction literature working its way into TV. And thank you. Okay, good. And then, of course, there's all the collectibles. This is another dimension of science fiction. All the clothing, all the toys. And there's hundreds, if not thousands, of websites on science fiction. And there's all the gaming, the VR, the augmented reality relevant to science fiction. And gaming has ended up impacting and influencing science fiction cinema, where now, last year, we had a very good and very popular science fiction movie, Ready Player One, which was based on a science fiction book, which was based on science fiction video games. And finally, we have lots of critical studies and histories of science fiction that have been written over the decades. If you're interested in looking at, the histories, the most comprehensive and in-depth examination of science fiction, which continually grows, is the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction by John Clute and Peter Nicholas. And that's online now, too, as well as in book form. But there's tons and tons of books which study science fiction. And so science fiction has developed a kind of self-consciousness of itself, too, which is another dimension of it. So there's all these different dimensions of holistic future consciousness in science fiction, from the movies, to the literature, to the people, to the awards, to TV, to video games. And all of them bring people into the paradigm of living science fiction. Now, the term science fiction was actually coined by this guy. This is Hugo Gernsback. And Hugo Gernsback was an immigrant from Luxembourg who came over to the United States around the turn of the century and started up various magazines, including Modern Electrics, and then Electrical Experimenter, and then Science and Invention. And finally, he started to publish in 1926 the first magazine devoted exclusively to science fiction, Amazing Stories. And you may wonder, what the hell is that scene? That's actually a scene from Jules Verne's Off on a Comet, which was reprinted in the first issue of Amazing Stories. But Gernsback in the early years called this entertaining and educational genre that taught us about the future of science and technology. He called it scientifiction or scientific fiction. But Gernsback also was a real conniver, got himself into a lot of trouble, got sued, and lost the magazine, Amazing Stories, in bankruptcy. But he immediately went out and started a new magazine, in fact, two new magazines, called Science Wonder Stories and Air Wonder Stories, which started up in 1929. He thought that he couldn't use his old expression, scientific fiction or scientifiction, because he thought they were proprietary for Amazing Stories. So he had to come up with a new word that he thought he wouldn't get sued on. So on the cover of this issue, October of 1929, Science Wonder Stories, down here, which you could barely make out, for the first time you see on the cover of a science fiction magazine, Science Fiction, 1929. Gernsback originally published the first Buck Rogers. There he is, the Buck Rogers, right at the beginning in 1928. And Buck Rogers, of course, went on to great fame and notoriety. If you look up there, the Electrical Experimenter, which was published back in the teens and the 20s, on the cover of that there is something that looks like a television or a visual telephone. And Gernsback in the 1930s had 3 or 4 televisions in his house. He was super duper crazy about science and technology and how they would change the world. He was a great advocate for it, and he thought that stories about the future of science and technology would actually educate and stimulate people and get them involved in science and technology, and it would convince people that science and technology was a really good thing, and it would engage them into further inventions. But he was clearly mistaken in thinking that science fiction, what he calls science fiction, and what he published in his magazines was simply about the future of science and technology. It clearly was not. It was a lot more than that. It included science and technology in the future, but indeed, it included stuff about the future of just about everything. Now, a good introduction to what science fiction is really about is one of the stories out of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. This is A Rose for Ecclesiastes, written by Roger Zelazny in the 1960s. This is the cover from Fantasy and Science Fiction magazine where the story was first published. And on the cover, you see this stylized woman holding a rose. And that woman there is Braxa, who is a Martian. The woman over here dancing is just another version of Braxa, because Braxa was a Martian who seduced a linguist poet from the Earth who had come to Mars to study the Martian culture and history, and she seduced him because the Martians had become sterile and they needed some new sperm in their genetic line, and he was drawn into this infatuating dance and mesmerizing appeal of Braxa, and he got her pregnant. And then she dumps him. Okay. Because he served his part. A Rose for Ecclesiastes has a little bit of science and technology in it, but it's mostly about human psychology, history, culture, the way aliens think, the way humans think, linguistics. It's about a little bit about the future of everything, and not primarily about the future of science and technology. It's a humanistic story. The only thing that's actually technological in it is that this guy has his scientist buddy friend make a rose on Mars, which he gives to her. Very famous story, very engaging, very powerful, and definitely demonstrates that science fiction is about more than just simply the future of science and technology. In fact, I've said it a little bit already, science fiction is actually about the future of everything. Now here's just another image, which I already showed you one of the Shrike. And that's the cover, the art off of the cover of the first novel of the Hyperion Cantos, which is 4 novels written by Dan Simmons that take place in the 29th century, and then a couple centuries thereafter. And Hyperion, I see as one of the greatest science fiction novels of all time. And when people say, oh, I don't like science fiction, or it's stupid, blah, 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 I tell them, go buy that novel. And if you tell me afterwards that it's stupid, then, I don't understand how your mind works. But Hyperion is this incredibly intricate, deep, powerful saga that involves the concept of immortality, where I get immortality by selling my soul to the devil, who's actually an alien. Stellar networks, where I jump between stellar systems. Philosophers and poets. A baby that goes backwards in time. Nanotechnological humans that live in outer space. Time travel, where the second coming turns out to be a woman who achieves it through time travel. Supercomputers and the rise and fall of civilizations. Religion. The reincarnation of the poet Keats, a philosophical debate between a modern Dalai Lama and the Grand Inquisitor. It's about the future of everything, and it is all integrated together into this incredibly intricate and powerful and literary piece of work that is modeled on Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And Dan Simmons was an English literature teacher, and he ended up turning to science fiction. But science fiction facilitates integrative understanding of the future. Integrative. Pull it all together. These are some other great ones that do the same thing. Stand on Zanzibar, which was written back in the late 60s and is an integrative vision of our time today. The Mars trilogy by Kim Stanley Robinson, which is so realistic and colorful that you forget you're reading science fiction. And it's the best trilogy, at least I think so, and a lot of other people do, best works on Mars. The Diamond Age by Neil Stephenson, which is an incredibly imaginative and bizarre and colorful book about China in the future, and nanotechnology, and matter, which is a cosmic vision. And then in the middle here, the 20th Century by Albert Robida. And I put that up there because that book was written in 1880. And it was probably one of the greatest science fiction novels of the 19th century. It was an integrative vision of Paris in the 20th century. And Robida was not only a great writer, who was at least, this book here is better than anything that Jules Verne wrote about the future. Robida being French also. But notice the designs. Robida was the first great science fiction artist. The book is illustrated with hundreds and hundreds of drawings that he put together on various things about the future. And it's a very comprehensive look at the future, integrative. It's a slice of life. Science fiction could also be culturally expansive. Two of the best books of the 21st century in science fiction are River of Gods and The Three-Body Problem. And notice I will frequently through this say best. And of course, this is my opinion, but if you go look at what other people think about what is best, and you read these things, these are the best. And these win the awards. River of Gods is a futuristic novel about India. Incredibly interesting novel in which the Hindu gods are super AIs that become real. The Three-Body Problem is a famous novel written by one of the great Chinese science fiction writers of contemporary times, finally translated into English and won Best Novel of the Year, and both of them give you interesting perspectives on Indian culture and Chinese culture. And this one in particular is fascinating because it brings up the issue of maybe it isn't a good idea to try to contact the aliens. Yeah. H.G. Wells did integrative thinking of a deep, incredible nature in a lot of his books, and H.G. Wells was a mental trip par excellence. He wrote well over 100 books. His biggest selling book was actually his Outline of History, which was the most authoritative book on history back during his time. And he wrote 20, 30 science fiction novels, at least, and probably 30 novels on the nonfiction books on the future. The Shape of Things to Come is a really intricate examination of human history combined together with a provocative prediction of the future. It is it's like a textbook. That's one way to describe it. But it definitely unites together, future scholarship with historical scholarship and pulls the whole thing together. Mentally very challenging. Now, the word everything can mean technology, the environment, people, marriage, religion, ecology, society, all the different pieces of human existence. But everything could also mean, in the bigger sense, everything, the entire universe. And when one becomes aware of, to whatever meager degree we can become aware of, the entire universe and our place within it, that's cosmic consciousness. That's seeing ourselves in the context of the cosmos. And science fiction does that too. Science fiction, for example, does that in H.G. Wells' The Time Machine. Not the movies, which are terrible versions of the novel. The novel is extremely powerful. The ending of it just takes you off into the immensities of time. when the time traveler, in fact, the image there is of the time traveler, millions of years in the future, standing on the shores of the earth when the sun has stopped moving, and he sees some strange thing in the water. I won't go into too much of the plot, but the time machine definitely generates cosmic consciousness. There's a quote here: "To romance of the far future is to attempt to see the human race in its cosmic setting." Olaf Stapleton. Who is Olaf Stapleton? Anybody know who Olaf Stapleton is? Right, of course he is. Right, great, right. Yes, yes. Okay. Olaf Stapleton was a younger contemporary of H.G. Wells who got a PhD in philosophy. In fact, his first book was on ethics, and then in the 1930s, he wrote two extremely mind-boggling science fiction novels that far exceeded in imagination anything that anybody had ever written, including H.G. Wells. They realized the level of cosmic consciousness that very rarely has ever been achieved by anybody, of a future of everything. The two books he wrote were Last and First Men and Star Maker. Arthur C. Clarke describes Star Maker as probably the most powerful work of imagination ever written by anybody anywhere. Now, I don't know if I would quite go that far, but it sure as hell is going to be right up near the top. Now, why is that? Because Stapleton didn't just think out hundreds, thousands of years. Stapleton thought out billions of years. In Last and First Men, he traces out the future evolution of humans 2 billion years into the future through 17 different successive species. He synthesizes history, philosophy, future studies, and science fiction. He creates the most expansive narrative visions of the future. In fact, in Star Maker, he doesn't go out 2 billion years. In Star Maker, he goes out 30 to 50 billion years. What the hell does it even mean? In Star Maker, he traces out the evolution of intelligence in the universe, beginning from the Earth and the Milky Way, as intelligences throughout the universe, the cosmos, evolve and begin to integrate into stellar, galactic, and cosmic minds. And they go on this journey in search of the Star Maker, who they make contact with in the end. And they are both evolutionary novels because the fundamental premise is the universe and humanity is evolving, and let's speculate on how it could possibly evolve into the future, but the very far distant future. And so these are two of the greatest science fiction novels ever written, and you could ask most people that and they'll say, yes, indeed they are. In fact, I think Star Maker is the best of the best. But Stapleton definitely created a cosmic perspective on science fiction and cosmic future consciousness. Now, why do I think that science fiction is evolutionary mythology, bringing a new angle on this whole thing? Well, when people use the word myth, they often use it to mean something which isn't true. But if we go back and we look at myth in history, we see that myths are stories involving extraordinary adventures with fantastical beings, often supernatural, with cosmic visions in them. And these beings often have fantastic powers. They often sometimes talk about prophecies and ends of the world. They go beyond the here and now. And back thousands of years ago, we were thinking about what the ultimate purpose and direction of the universe was. In fact, myths are narratives that are expressions of the far reaches of human imagination. And the people who told the myths of ancient times, and often still tell the same myths today, believe in the truth of those myths. They are stories in their minds of the credible transcendent. Myths are about the credible transcendent, and they influence people's thinking, they influence their perceptions in the past as they do in the present. Humans need myths, and myths in the sense of cosmic, fantastical narratives which inform and stimulate us and give us a sense of purpose and direction and meaning. And I will tell you right now, whether or not you think you don't have myths, I believe you do. It's just not the same myths that those other people have. Your myths are going to be scientifically informed, so you hope, okay? So, myths provide meaning and purpose and an explanation to things. If you go look at a definition up on the web of what a myth is, typically an ancient story dealing with supernatural, and instead of supernatural, you could put in there transcendent, involving a fundamental type or worldview of a people. That is, a myth is telling us something about the fundamental beliefs of a people or a culture, and it provides a way to express and articulate what the basic beliefs and values of that culture are in the form of a story. Now, Stapleton had a way of saying this when he thought about writing. Our aim is not merely to create aesthetically admirable fiction. We must achieve neither mere history nor mere fiction, but myth. A true myth is one which, within the universe of a certain culture, expresses richly and often perhaps tragically the highest aspirations possible within a culture. So the fundamental values and beliefs put in the form of a narrative as an expression of a culture is what Stapleton defines as a myth. And two science fiction writers, husband and wife, Alexei and Corey Panshin, when they wrote The World Beyond the Hill, said myths are stories about the credible transcendent. Now, when our religious stories of today, when our religious stories of the past lost their credibility over the last few hundred years, they were no longer credible transcendent. So what has taken their place is credible transcendent. And what Panshin recommends or states, and what I would suggest, is that science fiction has. Now, science fiction doesn't just simply deal in what is plausible or credible, it also still does the same thing that the ancient myths did, which is it stimulates the emotions and is inspirational and inspires. So science fiction is the modern, credible and inspiring transcendent, as opposed to the ancient myths, which were the ones that people generally believed in before. But there's no question about it that you are in a minority, and so am I, because the majority of people in the world still believe in the ancient myths as credible and referring to what is ultimately real and transcendent. So we're in a minority. They still, what they believed in before, a lot of people, percentage-wise, still believe in today. Now, if you look at the qualities of myth, myth has a lot of qualities, and I draw this off of Joseph Campbell and The Power of Myth and Carl Jung and his books on myth and archetypes. Myths have lots of different qualities. They're narratives. They presumably have truth value. There's personifications and archetypes in them. They have an aesthetic, emotional, motivational dimensions. They give personal meaning. There's icons. People participate immersively in them. There's rituals that are associated with myths, and they stimulate holistic consciousness. Their list of qualities for traditional myths, I will suggest to you, science fiction has all those qualities. Exactly the same. All the same qualities. And so as Panshin and husband and wife say, science fiction is the literature of mythic imagination. So just sort of to illustrate this, and by the way, here's another science fiction artist, Frank Frazetta, who did a lot of Edgar Rice Burroughs novel covers. I forgot to mention Hans Bach before. But number one, science fiction obviously is narratives, and they're engaging stories. I put up there 3 very engaging stories in science fiction: The Princess of Mars, The Island of Dr. Moreau, and The Path Through Tomorrow by Robert Heinlein. All very effective stories that grab people's attention and hold it. Science fiction has fantastical creatures, more fantastical than anybody else. Up there we have Old Faithful, who was a Martian, Tweel, who was a Martian, and the Black Destroyer, Kurl, who fed on potassium out of humans. One of the great hideous monsters who was created by A.E. van Vogt, who then sued many, many decades later the creators of Alien, saying that Alien ripped him off and that that was the original Alien up there. Yes, but a very good story. Science fiction, of course, has a lot of art, a lot of images to it, and science fiction goes off into the cosmic and fantastical. I mentioned Stapleton and Wells, but three other significant writers: Stephen Baxter, A Future History of the Universe; Greg Egan, Permutation City, which is a story that takes place in a kind of eternal virtual reality; and The Rapture of the Nerds, where religious people around the world try to rip off from the computer nerds the power to reincarnate their bodies as virtual minds. Those are all cosmic novels. They didn't get into trouble with the Lords of the Universe in the end. But it's very funny, you know. Icons in science fiction. Everybody knows that one. And there's another icon, Darth Vader. And Frankenstein and the Bride of Frankenstein. These are very popular visions. And Metropolis and the Female, and Alien, and Big Brother, and 2001, and Terminator, and the Dune giant worm, and the Statue of Liberty from Planet of the Apes. And three that you probably don't know, unless you know science fiction, three very famous images. The Shadow Out of Time from H.P. Lovecraft, one of the great paintings in science fiction. And those creatures literally exist in the story. Jenkins, who was the robot in Clifford Simak's City, very famous robot. In Shamblu, written by Catherine Moore, who was an alien female who was a Medusa and seduced men. And one of the earliest science fiction stories with sex in it. Those are three very famous images or icons from science fiction magazine covers. You like Shamblu. Shamblu is very good, yeah. Okay, science fiction motivates people into action. Science fiction presents both dystopian and utopian visions of the future, like We and Parable of Talents and Looking Backward, and Bulwer Lytton's The Coming Race, and Men Like Gods, all utopian novels written over the last century. So science fiction gives us images of preferable ways and non-preferable ways to go in the future. Science fiction has archetypes. One very significant archetype in science fiction is the robot. But I think that the archetypes in science fiction are actually evolutionary. They're not static, they're not eternal, they're not stable. And now here's a good example of the robot in science fiction in a state of evolution, because she was, from Ex Machina, one of the more intriguing and interesting modern versions of a robot. Have people seen this movie? Yeah, maybe, yes, right, yeah, definitely, yes. She's very good, and she passes the Turing test in a very ingenious and deceptive way. An interesting fact about science fiction and robots is that there's at least as many, if not more, female robots than male robots. The classic archetypal robot back from the 20s was the female robot in Metropolis. And the first robot to pass the Turing test was out of Future Eve, which was written back in 1885. It was a female robot created by Thomas Edison, fictitiously so. Science fiction makes lots of predictions about the future, about reality, about where things are going that are often right on target. In fact, this quote here from Arthur C. Clarke even goes a little bit further, that science fiction is the kind of literature that more than any other form of literature deals with reality, period. That is, science fiction takes you deeper into reality, more thoroughly, profoundly into reality than any other form of literature does. Because as Baruch Spinoza, the great 17th century philosopher, said, you know, the way to see the reality of things is to see it through the eyes of eternity, which means you see it through the perspective of the cosmos and the big picture of things. And that's what science fiction does. For a very riveting, and the guy must have been on speed when he wrote it, vision of the 21st century, Charles Stross Accelerando, for a very convincing vision of what will happen when computers become smarter than humans. And there's been plenty of stuff that's been written that's very predictive in science fiction, and cosmic science fiction with Arthur C. Clarke was superb at, like in 2001, and Rendezvous with Rama and Childhood's End. So, where is the difference between science fiction and ancient myth? Now, here's a gentleman that is forgotten but is incredibly important in the history of intellectual thought in the West, Bernard Lee Bouvier de Fontenelle. He, more than any other person, was responsible for convincing Christian Europe that Copernicus was right and Ptolemy was wrong. It wasn't Galileo who did that, because Galileo got thrown in the clink. It wasn't Bruno that did it, because he got burned at the stake. And it wasn't Copernicus who did it, because Copernicus, sort of disappeared into history very quickly. It was Fontenelle who did it. And he did it by being a intellectual diplomat and writing a great novel called The Plurality of Worlds, in which he convinced people in a narrative form that the other worlds up there had beings up there, and they revolved around the sun. And this quote really hits the nail on the head. When the heavens appeared to me as only a blue vault, the universe appeared little and confined with narrow bounds. I seemed oppressed. Presently, they give an infinite extent of profundity to this blue vault. It now seems to me that I breathe with much more liberty, that I am in a much greater extent of air, and that the universe is far more magnificent. Yes, Bernard. And what is he getting at? What he's getting at is that the myths of the past were fantastical myths seen as plausible within the context of ancient theories of reality. And ancient theories of reality personified the universe. Science fiction is fantastical images, but set in a different theory of reality that's informed by modern astronomy, secular progress, and the science of evolution. Science fiction adopts a new scientific theory of reality and what is credible that's different from what people accepted in the past, which was a personified universe. But this new universe is vastly more expansive, complex, and mysterious than the old universe envisioned by the ancients was. And I have up here John Herschel, who is the discoverer of that image you see in the back there of the Eskimo Nebula. And John Herschel, together with his sister, right? His sister, right, sweetie? It was his sister, yes. Wait. See, I went John. Herschel. William Herschel. Yes, William Herschel. Yes, right. William Herschel revealed to the world how vast space was, because Copernicus and Galileo Kepler had rearranged the configuration of things, but they didn't really have any conception of how big space was. And it was Herschel, with his increasingly more powerful telescopes, that revealed that space was immense. And so the universe became much more complex. And so science fiction mythology is much more expansive, imaginative, mind-boggling, immense in imagination and depth and detail to anything the ancients ever envisioned in their stories. No, not even close. John, his son was John, but he wasn't. Carolyn, by the way, thank you.
The first woman ever to be inducted into the English Astronomical Society, or
The royal family?
the
Royal Society, yes.
Royal
Right. But science fiction is so imaginative and is so unconstrained that at times it introduces into its stories things that are not scientifically plausible, in fact, involve elements of the religious and the mystical. If you look at Matrix, if you look at Star Wars, they have religious and mystical spiritual elements in them. It's not just simply science and technology. But that's the movies. Some of the greatest science fiction writers of all time, Doc Smith and Alfred Bester and Edgar Rice Burroughs and Camille Flammarion, all of whom wrote extremely important science fiction novels, they had all kinds of stuff in their novels that wasn't scientifically plausible, that was often religious and spiritual, and they would mix it all together. So you can't draw a really hard and fast distinction between science fiction fantastical stories and ancient myths ones, because a lot of times science fiction will draw into it stuff that really is not scientifically plausible at all. Also, sometimes science fiction will take ancient myths and retell them in a science fiction setting. In Lord of Light by Roger Zelazny, all of the ancient Hindu gods are now in existence and in fact are super technologized future humans who've adopted the identities of Brahman and Vishnu and also the Buddha and Shiva. In Ilium by Dan Simmons, we're in the future and on the surface of Mars, and the Greeks are sieging Troy, and the Greek gods are manipulating the whole thing from above, and it's all super technologized. How the hell did this ever happen? That's an interesting novel to read. In the Deathbird story, we go back to the Garden of Eden, and the devil turns out to be the good guy. And in Robert Silverberg's Trips, there's a story in there called Breckenridge and the Continuum, in which Silverberg presents a theory of science fiction in the form of a story. And his theory of science fiction is that we take the old myths and we mix them together in different ways and come up with new stories. And so science fiction will take literal stories from ancient myth and put them into science fiction clothing. And then we come to Philip Dick. And with Philip Dick, anything goes. Philip Dick was a genius. Philip Dick died penniless, died crazy, died young, and would include in his novels anything imaginable mixed together with science fiction stuff. Philip Dick thought that aliens were communicating with him into his brain. He literally thought this. And he wrote a novel about it called Valis. And he believed it because the aliens, when they told him that his son had a problem, a medical problem that the doctors didn't know about, and if they didn't figure out what it was, his son was going to die, and he took him to see a different doctor, and indeed the kid did have a problem. But be that as it may, in Philip Dick, in the novel Ubik, the dead are talking to the living, but the ones who think they are alive are really the ones who are dead, and the ones who are dead are the ones that are really alive. In The Man in the High Castle, the Germans and Japanese won World War II. And in the end, you figure out that that's the true story. And that's a complicated mess, too. In Counterclock World, everything goes backwards, including the fact that, first of all, you have to defecate before you could eat. And in Blade Runner, which was Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, that was made into a movie. So are a number of other ones up here made into movies. Yes, 5 minutes. Good, okay. And in fact, Philip Dick just pushed the limit on everything and doubted everything. So the sky's the limit with Philip Dick as far as what's plausible and what's credible. So we got 5 minutes left, and I got a couple more slides I'm going to do. So science fiction is the mythology of the future. It's about the future for the future. It expands our future consciousness, and it inspires us to engage in the creation of the future by creating credible new myths that are generally informed and inspired by science and contemporary thought, but still drag along other stuff into it. Now, besides the future, science fiction gets into alternate histories, alternate worlds, alternate universes, alternate realities, and what are called Jambor points, where there's significant points in history where if you go right, the world goes one way, if you go left, it goes a different way. The Man in the High Castle is an example of an alternate history. So is Bring the Jubilee, where Lee wins the Battle of Gettysburg, and that turns everything differently. And the Difference Engine, where the computer is invented in the 19th century, and that changes everything. And the Legion of Time, where two different factions of the future are fighting over who's going to win in the present. And alternate realities and alternate histories can get really crazy. In the Hominid trilogy, there's a second temporal line where the Neanderthals survive and Homo sapiens disappear, and one of the Neanderthals comes into our world. What Mad Universe, where a character jumps into a quantum variation on our universe. The Time Ships, which creates an infinite number of different quantum variations. And also one of the great science fiction novels of the 21st century, Perdido Street Station, which is an amazingly imaginative, incredible piece of work in which the central female character is the scientist's lover, and this female character is a woman with the head of a bug, and she's an artist who creates sculptures by eating different colored berries and shitting the gel out her rear end and then turning it into different forms. Okay? It's an amazing story. Yes, and Jeannie will tell you that this guy verbally blows you away. He has this incredible vocabulary. He unites together into that novel fantasy, horror, science fiction, cyberpunk, and everything else under the sun. So we got one last slide. So why do I call it evolutionary? The future ain't what it used to be, and as Dan Simmons pointed out to me, it never was. Everybody's heard the first part, but Simmons said, of course, there's another part to it. Science fiction is evolutionary because it is a deep cumulative history that builds upon itself. As an example, in these three successive novels, 1895, 1930, and 1995, each of those authors takes the topic of the future evolution of humans and interprets it in evolutionary terms, but over that 100-year period, the theory of evolution has been evolving, so by the time we get over to Greg Egan's Diaspora, we have an evolution of humans that goes off into virtual reality minds and robotic bodies. We're back with the Time Machine. We just had the Morlock and the Eloi. And last and first men, we have genetic engineering in there. So evolution evolves, and in fact, it informs our visions of the evolution of humans. Science fiction is based on the fundamental theory of cosmic evolution, which is the central theory in science. And we often envision in science fiction the future of humanity, not just the future of science and technology, the future of humanity. So we envision it as informed by the theory of evolution. And these three are not the only three. There's been tons and tons of other books about the future evolution of humans, about superhumans. The Son of Man by Silverberg, and Odd John, which is by Stapleton II, and Darwin's Radio, which is relatively recent. So science fiction is continually delving into the future evolution of humans informed by the theory of evolution itself. And in so doing, it is guiding and enhancing our thinking about our own future. We think it out. We think out where we want to go and how we want to evolve into the future. So anyway, that is a good place to stop. Okay? So thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions,
Yes.
if
Okay.
anyone would like to
Right.
ask a question.
Yes, go ahead.
I noticed that my favorite science fiction magazine that I was reading in the 50s is hardly ever mentioned or displayed, and that was If.
If, right.
If. That was my favorite sci-fi magazine
right.
at the time. What happened to it?
I'm not an expert on If, but if you saw my bigger presentation, there is mention of If in it. In fact, I have some copies of If at home, but I didn't read it, and I would have to go look and see what happened to it, why it disappeared. But it did disappear, of course. Yeah.
The other item was a quote from Isaac Asimov, who made a point of saying that he wrote science fiction, not fiction science.
Right. Right. Yes. But he was a hard science fiction writer. Yes. Yeah. Some of the time. Yes. Right here.
Thank you. Will you tell us, please, what is speculative fiction?
Speculative fiction was an expression that people developed back in the 1960s and 70s when people in science fiction decided that the term science fiction was too narrow to describe what they were writing. So they wanted to expand their reference by getting rid of the word science and just calling it speculative. But it never quite took. And so we're left with this interesting oddity, which is that the genre continues to be called science fiction, although long before Gernsback, it covered more than science, and long before Gernsback, it would have been what the speculative fiction. So we still call it science fiction, although people, in fact, Silverberg back in the 60s and 70s was one of the individuals involved in new wave thinking who wanted to get rid of science fiction and call it speculative fiction. J.G. Ballard, Harlan Ellison, that era of the 60s and 70s. So it was supposed to be a more liberal, broader term to encompass humanistic thinking and anything that was involving flights of the imagination. But then it's hard to distinguish it from fantasy, which is another whole story. Yes? Mm-hmm.
So wanted to...
we got to stop?
Yep, we got to stop.
Yep.
Wanted to do a tradition that we have here. We
Right.
have a Sunday mugging. So thank you very much for your time here, Mr.
Yes.
Lombardo.
Thank you.
And thank you very much.
Okay, now wait, one last thing. Wait, just one last thing. Is if you're interested in purchasing any of my books, I'm up here and I'll give you a good deal on them, okay?
Thank you very
Okay,
much.
All right, thank you. Uh-huh. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, okay.
Turn your mic off
Oh, yeah,
so you can talk to people.
yes. Right. It's hard to see it.